We had been thinking recently of trying to kind of establish a sort of an event, a habit at the AA, in which we would ask someone to come for a week or so, to spend, as always at the AA, as long as they can at the AA, as short as time as possible at the hotel. But a way in which we could ask someone to come and present a kind of lecture to the whole school, and then perhaps work with graduate students and others in seminars. And I hope this will be the first of kind of many such events. When thinking then about who we would like to have and what we would like them to consider, it was, I think, fairly obvious, to answer the second question first, that there was a great deal of interest in the school, both at a graduate and undergraduate level, not simply, I think, in the work of Gilles Deleuze, but in the very kind of assumption that there was a direct relation between that work and the possibilities of architectural thought. Having got there, it then seemed to us that John Rajchman was the person who we would like to invite. We did, and here he is. He's in fact going to talk about Deleuze precisely with a view to what you might call the practicality of it, how to do things with Deleuze, to examine Deleuze in a sense from the point of view of experimentation and practice. Many of you will know John Rajchman from his previous books on kind of theory and on Deleuze. His most recent books have been Constructions and the Deleuze Connections, both of which published by MIT. And he has recently published an article in Book Forum on Deleuze's Francis Bacon, the sort of account of the diagram in Deleuze, or one account of the diagram. John Rajchman is an adjunct professor at Columbia University in the art history department. I don't think he's been to the AA before, and therefore we welcome you very much indeed.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction, also the invitation, the occasion to talk again about Deleuze in the context of architecture and with architects. I thought maybe what would be useful to do would be to try to take one problem in Deleuze, a little bit different maybe than some of the problems that have already been of interest to architects, to try to develop that problem and see what ramifications it might have in different fields, and in particular in architecture. And then having posed a bit this problem, maybe in the seminars to try to look more precisely at those possibilities or implications. So I think Deleuze is a sprawling and very complicated thing. There are many ways in it and out of it, and I'd like to look at one of them, what I'll call the problem of time and memory. The problem is interesting in its own right and might supply a point of encounter or connection that Deleuze himself did not consider, or which we don't encounter in him alone. And later in the seminars, I'd like to look at two of them, the so-called memory industry and the related transformations in the monument form, and the destiny of this interesting cinema architecture connection in a moment of media and so-called time-based art. So those are the two topics. At the same time, the problem goes to the heart of Deleuze's philosophy itself, I think, his peculiar way of doing theory, or what he called his image of thought. Because I think he had what might be called a time-based style of thinking. But in what way is thinking, is I think or we think, based in time? And how does this time-based nature contrast with the media events which tend to turn us into passive consumers of what happens to us? And why did Deleuze think that this problem of the time that requires or takes thought is to be found in all the arts, or in art itself? That in anything called art, we always find an attempt to create other spaces and other times. And what relations does this problem have, therefore, with sciences or politics, or the problem at once technological and neurological of duration in our thinking or in our brains? I think Immanuel Kant is the philosopher who played a key role for Deleuze in formulating the philosophical problem. Deleuze saw Kant as freeing the notion of time from its subordination to movement, and imposing it instead as a matter of the senses, of what's inside us and what's outside us, prior to causal laws or substantive categories. The very idea of the transcendental that was a key to Kant's critical philosophy, and against which Deleuze would develop his own aesthetics, is tied up with this relation of time in relationship to I think or we think. And therefore, this new idea of time in Kant is central to the very idea of critical philosophy. So Deleuze develops this idea, and one of the things we can say about this Kantian revolution is that time is no longer conceived of as simply succession, nor space as the simultaneity of objects in successive states of the world that would follow from one another like a great Newtonian clock, or even in Leibniz's attempt to show that everything is ultimately, or in principle, analytic in the unfolding of the world. It doesn't work, in other words, according to what Henri Bergson would later call the cinematic illusion. It's a matter of the senses, this outer sense and inner sense. Space is outer sense in Kant, which means that when you see something in space, you perceive it as outside of you. Time, inner sense, how we affect ourselves in time. But in contrast to Husserl, Deleuze took this experimentalist way out of the fog of transcendence that Kant had introduced in philosophy, and he tried to break away from the very idea of consciousness itself. The Husserlian idea of consciousness itself, how it was grounded in the life work. And he tried to elaborate another image of thought, another relationship to the senses, with new conditions and presuppositions that would be at once subjective and objective, geographical and social. And it's those assumptions that Deleuze would find in cinematic thinking. For in fact, cinema is more Bergsonian than Bergson realized. He thought of it as a great laboratory to cast in sensory terms this time, which is not succession, and that supposes other heterogeneous spaces irreducible to the homogeneous segments of a succession. So I think that this larger philosophical problem, how to render in sensory terms the time that is in us, in our ecologies, our space, as once artificial or natural, was a central theme in Deleuze's philosophy and his aesthetics. And it is to this time, this peculiar time that's in us, in our world, and in our ecology, that cinema explores, that Deleuze opposed memory or recollection, insofar as memory or recollection is structured by succession and captured in consciousness. He was concerned, in other words, with those things that happen to us or figure in our bodies, in our brains, that go beyond consciousness itself. And that's why presenting time was one way out of memory, as central to the notion of consciousness itself, as when it is said by philosophers and neurologists now, that the self is memory, or is a kind of recollected biography. Already in Proust, Deleuze finds the question not of memory, but of the story of a kind of intelligence and the signs required to attain this strange, complicated time that cinema, in its own way, would make visible and audible to us after the war. So this sense that the time of thinking exceeds or comes before you or I or even we was what allowed Deleuze to say that's what's new in the present. It's not what's in fashion, but what we can't see or don't yet see is happening to us, and is therefore central to Deleuze's very idea of what it is to think. So, just a few remarks about the larger philosophical context. So the problem of time and memory is therefore part of, I think, Deleuze's larger conception of philosophy. And it shows why that conception was not formalist, not culturalist, not media-oriented, or historicist. I think that Deleuze at first tried to work out the subjective and objective presuppositions of thinking, but in the 80s he came to cast the picture of time-based thinking in a particular way in terms of the figure of an interceder or mediator who intervenes in artistic, techno-scientific, or political complex, discovering a kind of series of encounters or connection. We all need our interceders, he declared, even in politics. So he thought the 80s was a kind of impoverished time in which, lacking any sense of resistance to the present, philosophers had turned back into reflection and communication and consensus, leading to a crisis in thinking or theory itself, sketched at the end of his books on cinema. And no doubt this sense of a reactive moment in the 80s refers back to 68, which, as Foucault said, led to a crisis not simply in the university, but in knowledge or in thinking itself. And in his seminar, because Deleuze after 68 came to Paris in this new open university at Vincennes, started teaching, in that philosophy department they refused the so-called progressivity of knowledge, something like what literary people call canon, and the doors opened to lots of different people, in particular artists and musicians and architects. And Deleuze said it was this open discussion, it was they and their questions, which brought home to him the sense that there always exists a non-philosophical understanding of philosophies in the arts themselves or in architecture, of which philosophy has need and to which it is addressed. And so the seminar was one of the places of these encounters and connections that Deleuze developed in his picture of the thinker as a mediator or intervener. So the volumes on cinema, written during the same period in the 80s, perhaps the most extended attempt to work out this picture. But since cinema is also, Walter Benjamin said in the 30s already in an interesting way, a mass industrial art, it poses the question of thinking and the time that takes thought, its relation to media, communication, information, and this strange kind of virtual public that grew up around post-war cinema. And Deleuze felt increasingly was confronted by what he called societies of control. So this idea of open university and critical public, of course, lots of people were interested in the same time at these things besides Deleuze, sometimes talked about in terms of public sphere. And for example, Thomas Hirschhorn, who's made something called the Deleuze Monument, came from this kind of Boycean social sculpture, made these things called memory pieces in urban environments. So when he made a Deleuze monument, not Deleuze on a pedestal, but an attempt to create a zone of these kinds of relations in a particular French city in relationship to media coverage. So it was in these circumstances, in other words, in the 80s, that Deleuze tried to recast his image of thought in terms of intervening in this kind of reactive moment. It was his attempt, as it were, to continue this great principle Spinoza advanced in his ethics, to be the greatest number, to think the most. But what then does it mean to think or have an idea in cinema or in literature or in architecture? And why is there no thinking in general, only in some domain or some discipline, at the same time a source of unexpected or unforeseen links with others? So in the 80s, Deleuze elaborated the problem of time and memory in the volumes on cinema. I'm just trying to give a little context in which he developed this problem. But what was he trying to do in these? He wrote 2 volumes on cinema, one called, I guess, I don't know how much Deleuze people have read, one's called Cinema 1, Movement Image, then Cinema 2, Time. So in the preface, he says that his study, it's not a history of cinema, but of the study of the irreplaceable forms invented by filmmakers through which cinema takes part in the history of art and of thought. For the auteurs of these films are to be confronted not simply with painters and architects or musicians, but also with thinkers. They, I'm quoting him, they think with time images and movement images rather than with concepts. And later in the 2nd volume, he declared that the essence of cinema, as distinct from the generality of films, has its highest aim in nothing else than thinking and its function. For example, Vertov, man with a camera, famous cinematic look at the various movements in the day life of Moscow, is the invention of one way of thinking with movement images, which has a new kind of materialism of the eye in relationship to intervals that would later become very important for the experiments with so-called structural film or experimental film in New York in the 60s, and forming, therefore, a larger series of connections. So Deleuze tries to extract or select the irreplaceable forms from the generalities of films, connecting with others, and the result is the isolation of a complex way of thinking, a complex way of presenting time, which undergoes a mutation after the Second World War and confronts a new informational and televisual complex, discovering in the process many connections with the arts and with sciences, which this whole process at the time that Deleuze was writing in 1985, he felt was itself facing a crisis. So the study of cinema was, for him, a peculiar kind of investigation, an attempt to extract thinking as a zone of connections. And I just, a few more meta remarks. I just wanted to say that this approach is interesting in part to me, since it's a little bit different from 2 others, the idea of medium and the idea of Clement Greenberg, the proposed modernist idea of medium, the idea of media posed by Marshall McLuhan, understanding media. So Deleuze's study of cinema is not the history of a medium like painting, which gives up its content in favor of its form or turns in on itself in the face of the rise of kitsch. Its specificity or essence is not determined by the purity of its conventions or the technical apparatus that it uses, but rather in the new way it invents, taking such means to think, which, as it turns out, is to present time. And thus, Deleuze's book takes over the distinction between modern cinema and classical cinema, from Bazin, you already see it, and post-war cinema. Post-war cinema that's after the war, neorealism, goes to France, the Nouvelle Vague, finally gets to Germany, American experimental film, that formation called modern cinema and before classical cinema. The modern classical division is not cinema turning in on itself, getting rid of narrative and figure in a kind of illusion apparatus. It's the problem of how to present time in cinematic thinking and how to explore the new spaces, these empty spaces and vacant and leftover and disconnected spaces in which this new kind of exploration of time took place in cinema. So, and I think it's not exactly Deleuze's study of film, the kind of media that McLuhan tried to understand, or what Friedrich Kittler calls the technological a priori of media networks, because the technical means, the camera, the editing, the projection, and so forth, matter more in the way they depart from natural perception, or the way vision is usually controlled, the way they interrupt it, the way they introduce another sense of time and movement, not simply into the brains and the bodies of the actual characters in the films, but also in the public. So the problem is not one which at least a hasty reading of McLuhan would suggest, the invasion of a book galaxy by a new audiovisual one, and the source of sense ratios or regimes that it creates in television and the global village. Because a technical apparatus never determines thinking in sensory or audiovisual terms. It only supplies the means to go beyond it and to think in other terms, thus discovering connections with many other arts, like painting or literature, in the old Gutenberg galaxy. And in fact, French cinema, this same phenomenon, which is very original and interesting in audiovisual time, had very close relationship with literature, with book culture. So it's when in both domains you departed from something that you had interesting connections. Okay. So therefore, Deleuze thought the problem is not to lament or celebrate new media, but to invent new ways to actually think in the conditions that those new media create. And in the case of cinema as mass industrial art, in relationship to this statistical view of the public, the patterns of distribution, the new kinds of control of sensibility. So it's in this context, I now come to my problem, that Deleuze says that unlike most television, which tends to turn us into passive spectators, or worse, voyeurs of events, in which there tends to be an unproblematic relation between the camera and the screen. In cinema, or in the manner of thinking in cinema, and here's the sort of principle of Deleuze's book, the camera is never in the present. So what does Deleuze mean when he says the camera is never in the present? How does that work out in cinematic terms? So one way the problem of memory is therefore posed cinematically is through flashback or recollection. Something is amiss in the present, and the flashback, often given through voice and image, helps to explain what. That's like in detective novels or whodunits, or with what Walter Benjamin famously saw as Adjé's attempt to photograph Parisian spaces as though they were scenes of some invisible crime. But Deleuze thought another kind of question is posed, which he found in short stories or novellas, the question, what has happened, which the short story itself doesn't resolve. The research to pose that problem. And cinema, therefore, starts to explore something that has happened, but which can't be captured or explained by any possible recollection or flashback, or what amounts to the same thing, when it, in Deleuze's cinema theory, when it departs from the accord that's established between the subjective time of the cameras, the characters, and the objective time of the cinema, or the structure or geometry of veridical narration that links one to the other. In other words, when it starts to make visible blocks or durations, sheets of time, he calls them, that coexist in a present that's thereby rendered uncertain or problematic in a world or in a space which no single character or group of characters can ever completely master or capture. That's, I think, what he means by the camera is never in the present. And for Deleuze, the post-war filmmaker who goes the furthest in thus separating time or duration from conscious recollection, either individual or collective, is the filmmaker Alain Resnais. Of Alain Resnais, perhaps know Alain Resnais from Hiroshima Mon Amour, a very important film in the beginning of the 60s and part of the whole creation of this cinema culture in France. He says of Alain Resnais that the notion of memory in Resnais is as important as those affected by Proust in literature or Beck's in philosophy. Although Resnais developed it in this peculiar interval at the end of the world wars, these European civil wars of mass mobilization and destruction. And in the aftermath of those wars, and in the kind of decolonizing violence and displacement that they unleashed, in Resnais interested in Algeria also, in Resnais, we find one sense in which the problem of presenting time in cinema concerns thinking itself, because it's as though Resnais had a particular idea of the thinker as somebody who comes back from the dead, as in Plato, but without the compensation of eternity or salvation or redemption or dialectic, who has an encounter with the past, with what has happened, that disturbs and overwhelms the present and can no longer be found easily in what's inside and what's outside, requiring a new kind of spatial exploration. And the word, in general, in Resnais's cinema, Deleuze finds these new characters that come back from the dead, but also these spaces that he maps. One of the techniques Resnais's famous for is the tracking shot, which is this hand that reveals space. The diagrammatic function of the camera, says Deleuze. And what it shows is how the space relates to mental functions. So you have these mental maps that the camera does. So you have a cinematic exploration of this kind of neurotopological ways in which death itself, and of course it's the period of mass death, is inside us and outside us. And in particular, this mass death, this 6 million who haunt the camps. And in Resnais's documentary Night and Fog, 1953, Deleuze says that, here I'm quoting it, it's the sum of all the ways of escaping from the flashback and the false piety of the recollection image. Because in this documentary, Resnais collected the past in black and white. It's composed of this archival footage, photographic as well as filmic, drawn from many sources, of course, some of them necessarily propagandistic. There's even Leni Riefenstahl. The present is shown in color through these famous traveling shots, through which Resnais tried to diagram retrospectively what must have been the mentality in the space of the camps. You look through windows, you see. Of course, it's a fact about the camps, or the space of the camps, that the voiceover mentions that none of the individuals knew what was going on. So it's the exploration of the space. So that's the present. And then there's a future, which is given in the voiceover and the sort of discord of the music score, which says we don't know whether this is over and whether it will still happen in the future. That's sort of the structure of this documentary, famous documentary. Night and Fog, therefore, for Deleuze, gives a sense of this death that is not in the present, that overwhelms the present, that's not in us, that couldn't be recollected in the present in 50s Gaullist France, that belongs to this terrible sheet of the past, irreducible to the piety of any individual or collective prise de conscience, taking consciousness, shown rather in discords or troubles, dreams and fantasies of our thinking and of what it means to think. So, incidentally, René's documentary, Night and Fog, very different from Claude Lanzmann's Shoah, because in Claude Lanzmann's Shoah, there's a deliberate elimination of all archival materials in favor of memory of people talking, not the false piety. And so this Night and Fog film within memory discourse is connected to this larger issue of whether or not you include relics and remains, and because archival footage is, as lots of people have said, linked technologically to what it represents. Okay, so, and it's in this way that René posed this problem in this documentary in a way that he would go on to explore in fiction films, in Hiroshima Mon Amour, with a screenplay by Marguerite Duras, but also in a film called Muriel. It's about, it's very interesting for architecturally to how the camera describes the spaces as these urban spaces in which there's the secret of torture that's taking place in Algeria. Okay, so, and this problem of life and death, its relationship to this attempt to get at the problem at once in fiction and in documentary is, I think, central and will become central to the work of somebody who collaborated with René on this film, Chris Marker, who would develop it in his own way, in particular in relationship to new technologies, video, digital, and so forth. And Sans Soleil, I see, is at the ICA, so it's one of the great results of this. And you'll see it's ambiguous whether it's a documentary or a fiction. So I think that this, the fact that Deleuze focuses on René and says that René goes the farthest of all the filmmakers in creating this sense of coexistence of durations in the space of the present, raises a larger general issue about Deleuze and Deleuze's cinema books that increasingly seems important for people now. And that's the role that the war, or what people call the trauma of the war, plays in Deleuze's account of cinema, and in particular through this passage from movement images to time images. And what does it mean, for example, when Deleuze says that the aim of post-war cinema, the highest aim, the aesthetic aim, to give us a new brain and a new body, to restore our belief in the world, which would contain an element of violence, an element of resistance to the present, that would have to confront the new spaces of information and communication of which television would form a part. And how should we think about this problem today when there's arisen something called the memory industry, a kind of mass aesthetic of witnessing the violence and injustice of the past, the problem it poses about the incompatibility of reconciliation and truth and so forth, and how does this larger formation lead to changes in the monument form itself in its relationship to time or history in our thinking, which I think takes us beyond the great reflections of Alois Wiegel about monuments and history in the 30s, and is linked to this attempt to introduce voids and uncanny spaces and relics into the monumental space. And that's the larger topic that I wanted to look at in this seminar. So, what then does, or how then is Deleuze related to this other formation, which he didn't directly talk about, but which, since he picks this as so central to his account of cinema, he seems to be linked. So, the camera is never in the present. That means that there's something in the past that is beyond closure, if you're a narratologist or a psychotherapist, or presence, if you're a deconstructivist. And in this regard, the problem of time and memory in Deleuze, or his notion of thinking when the camera is never in the present, poses this problem in a distinctive way that's connected up with his larger philosophical conception of time itself as a potential in the past that runs counter to memory or recollection, which might be put in this way. The basic problem is not history and memory, but time and space, because they're related, in relation to both history and memory as a kind of deterritorializing force or potential. In a certain sense, what we call history or memory are, in fact, only re-territorializations of our relations with such forces in our history and in our memory. And the problem then is how to render and what it means to render those forces in cinematic terms. And second, the basic problem is not individual and collective memory, but rather of a strange kind of pre-personality or impersonality of space and time that precedes both individual and collective memory, or opens them to other kinds or other potentials, or now what's called powers of subjectivization. So the question becomes, how in cinema, how did the auteur of cinema like René explore or describe or render these pre-individual or pre-collective spaces from which new processes of subjectivization, sometimes called becoming, arise with this invention or fabulation of something that doesn't yet exist. And Deleuze sees this, for example, in the way Marguerite Duras, in her cinema, dissociated the sound image and the visual image to get at places without stories and stories without places. But the question arises also in minority, or what Deleuze, writing in 1985, could still call third world cinema. Geography put it a little bit different today. For minority is not an identity for Deleuze, it's a kind of socially and sociologically unrecognizable force, the unfolding of which cannot be completely contained in distinctions between public and private, inside and outside, presumed by the corresponding majority. So this supposition of a pre-individual or pre-collective spatial and temporal determinations of the sort we see in minor literature or in cinema, in Kafka already, is something I think that's distinctive in Deleuze's general view of time, and so of the question he poses when he asks, what is it to think in cinema or cinematic terms? So the prefix pre-individual or pre-collective, it's not something that precedes in a linear succession, but like a virtuality or potential in any given succession of another kind of time or duration that Deleuze compared to these caesura points in Hölderlin's view of tragedy, which mark in the history, in a given history, individual or collective, the potential of other unexpected histories. So if then, after the war, and at least in part in relationship to it, the question of what happened in it, there emerged a new problematic of time in aesthetic and philosophical thinking, a new sense of time in what happens to us beyond individual or collective memory. And for which there exists no prise de conscience, but which arts, such as cinema, help to make visible or palpable or real, thus serving a function that cannot completely be reduced to communicating or transmitting information. So, and that is a change in the sense in which filmmakers thought of film as appealing to masses. Because rather than trying to bring self-consciousness to the masses, as in Soviet film, or to subject them from above, as in fascist films, like the famous Lenin Riefenstahl mass rally films, thinking in post-war time images involves a function more like what Foucault would call counter-memory, not a memory that runs counter, but in thinking the supposition of a form of time that departs from the whole idea of history as recollection or memory of the past, introducing into it and the use of history or archive in the public functioning of thinking about it, not eternity, but this problematizing moment of the untimely. Thus, in relationship to time, not simply does there arise new figures or characters moving about tentatively in disconnected or empty spaces within the very medium Walter Benjamin thought best suited to showing the masses, but also a new kind of public linked to this activity of thought and this complex interrelation between thinking, aesthetic subjectivization, seen in the relations of auteur in character or figures or public, would, thought Deleuze, be in turn elaborated in minority film and confront this informational situation. Of course, now film still, in many geographic situations, an important medium. Anyway, Deleuze's elaboration of the problem of time and memory in post-war cinematic thinking thus has a number of ramifications. First, I'd like to mention maybe one. The first has to do with something that's real, that breaks open the distinction between fiction and documentary, or fiction and ethnography, the two poles in cinema, also found in photography, and discovering a new kind of realism. Because in documentary, you have a veridical narration. The structure of a documentary has a veridical narration when the witnesses and the people that are telling you about things and the things that you're shown have an accord. It's when that breaks open that you have some other kind of structure. And it's that breaking open of the relationship between the subjective figures, what they see, whether they're witnesses or they're just fictional characters, and this objective space, which breaks away at once from fiction and from documentary to describe a reality irreducible to each, if I could put it like that, or something. And so maybe this realism of time images could be confronted with Adorno's famous dictum that there's no poetry after Auschwitz. Maybe only a new kind of fiction, or else a new kind of documentary or ethnography, which breaks with this space of veridical narration, is able to attain the peculiar reality of this past that's still with us or that haunts us, and to render it in cinematic and aesthetic thinking. So I have a few remarks which I'll spare you that say some more about the implications of this in the interest of time. But I guess as a conclusion to this part of my discussion, I wanted to suggest that the way Deleuze develops this problem of time and memory in the cinematic thinking that comes after the war, today, as it has then, has many interesting connections and resonances and interferences with those same problems as are explored in other arts, like photography or sculpture or installation, as well as in what is an acrimonious contemporary debates in psychology and psychoanalysis and neurology over a thing called trauma. It seems to me it's an interesting cluster in which we might retrospectively place Deleuze. So what's the advantage of Deleuze in this, and the way he develops the problem, and what uses might we make of it today? I think that Deleuze, as a kind of thinker, was not a melancholy thinker, not what I call a melancholy critic. At the time of the World Wars, Walter Benjamin turned the melancholy of losing oneself in space and time into a kind of great diagnostic condition of his critical thought. But after the war and in Nietzsche, Deleuze found a kind of more affirmative model linked to what Nietzsche called possibilities of life and active forgetting. And the result is another kind of critique et clinique, criticism and clinical relation, which is seen in one way in the Russian figure of the idiot, which Deleuze, like Kurosawa, would take over in films, but also in the way American literature would go on the road, and how this Russian and American movement would depart from the more rational and bookish European novel. Thus, the problem of time and memory in Deleuze in general is not posed, nor does it require the postulation of a primal absence or void or loss of the sort sometimes associated with minimalist reduction, but rather with potentials to be exploited in thinking in art, or thinking in art, as with the cinematic attempt after the war to give us back a brain and body in which to think, or to again believe in other possibilities in this world rather than salvation or redemption in the next. And this general aspect of Deleuze's way of posing the problem lead to two further thoughts about things that might be done with Deleuze today or after Deleuze. First, rather than the familiar modernist or formalist picture of the elimination of story and narration from an illusion of space, Deleuze posed the problem of modern cinema in terms of a kind of materialism of sensation and its role in processes of subjectivization of collective individuals, as I've tried to describe. Thus, in painting or literature as in cinema, the figures and characters move from a space of molding to a space of modulation, or from fixed pose or grounded individualization, narrative description becomes less organic, more crystalline, eventually breaking the rules of veridical narration altogether. And the figures in Francis Bacon are Deleuze imagines as ones that occupy and therefore expose within painting itself this space that's prior to illustration, narration, and figuration. Analysis of Francis Bacon. So these new kinds of characters emerge that include or express time itself as distinct from memory in their bodily attitudes, as Deleuze thought in Warhol or Ackerman or Beckett, or in their brains, as with Bismarck or René, inhabiting these other kinds of space. So when time is freed from the joints of recurrent movement in ourselves and our habits, as well as in the stars above, from cosmology as well as psychology, there is a new problem of processes of subjectivization, the larger kinds of space and time, the larger ecologies, artificial and natural, in which they occur. The problem Deleuze thinks opened up by Kant, developed by cinema. Of course, Deleuze not alone in stressing the theme of time in Kant. Just a philosophical aside, we find it in the 20s in Martin Heidegger in his Kant book, in the debate he had with Tessier about neo-Kantianism and so forth. But instead of Heidegger's problem of finitude, in field of metaphysics, Deleuze poses this problem of time in relationship to us, or the sensation of time in relationship to us, affect of time to us, in terms of a question of a life as a potential at once inside and outside the corresponding individual. So the Husserl-Bergson contrast in the cinema book is part of a larger philosophical sequence which goes back to Kant's invention of the transcendental and how to get out of it in its relationship to death, mass, individual, collective, as we saw in the case of Alain René. So just two remarks about this general approach. I have time? Yeah. Sorry, I'm multiplying layers. The question of this cerebral cinema, because Alain René, it's a cerebral cinema, but of a very interesting and peculiar sort. It's these thinkers that have, the characters that have a certain relationship to death that causes them to think. This cerebral thinking is one way of developing a new materialism in thinking. And already in Berthoff, the materialism of the eye, that's the passages on Berthoff, very interesting in the cinema book, and my colleague at Columbia, Jonathan Crary, in his book on suspensions of perception, has gone on to show how there's this interesting problem, historical adjacency and conceptual proximity of this materialism Berthoff and painting in Cézanne. But in his last writings, Deleuze suggested we think of the brain itself, not simply as an object of neuroscience, but as the materiality of the image of thought he was trying to work out in the volume on cinema. The materiality of the time that takes thought. And I think that this general problem, how to introduce time into materials, aesthetic materials, but also us, our body, our brain, was posed in different ways in French philosophy, the various ways in which different philosophers tried to work out the idea that thinking is never in the present. In the case of Lyotard, in the case of developed in terms of the theme of immateriality. But Althusser, he also talked about, late Althusser, about aleatory materialism, chance, interested chance in material. But Foucault, I think, is still interesting in this regard in his attempt to free history from the model of memory in favor of a materiality of the archive, the time of its transformation. Because Nietzsche helped see how the body formed part of this history. That's when he says that in disciplinary society, the soul is the prison of the body. Could we then elaborate and extend this kind of critical materialism to what Deleuze saw as societies of control, and therefore to our current obsession with our brain and the relationship to our genes, in which many of the problems of time and memory have been taken up again? And could we more generally develop a new picture of the life of the sciences, the way they themselves grow and throw off new problems of the sort Foucault had already seen in the French historian of science, Georges Canguilhem. But at the same time, the problem of time and memory might be developed in another way in terms of a theory of critical sociality of thought, or of the thought that takes time. And at one point, as if in passing, Deleuze says that this new time in the Kantian revolution of time with respect to I think or we think, as captured in Hamlet's phrase, the time without a joint, that time is, again I'm quoting it, the time of the city and nothing else. So what does he mean by this? In what ways does the city supply a materiality for what Georg Simmel already was calling the mental life of the metropolis, the Geist of the metropolis? In what ways is this now still an aesthetic problem, but in relation to new urban formation? So I think in Deleuze was very attracted to an essay of Georg Simmel on sociality. What he found interesting is a concept of sociality that's not based in fixed or prior social positions. It's freed from. So the sociality is freed from fixed territories or when movement is introduced to it. And the city is the place for this absolute deterritorialization from which there's no way back, that Deleuze saw as a condition of the voyage or thinking itself, or the time that takes thought. And that's why for him, since the Greeks, philosophy has been something like the city thinking and the city of force that deterritorializes the state-territory relations, later to be discovered in Europe for the problems of nationalism and minority, as with Kafka in Prague. And traditionally, those problems connected to life and death, as already in the case of tragedy. So, in other words, the processes of subjectivization discover the element of time just when they break away from the kinds of movement that tied them to identity, to fixed beginnings and endings, as when Hölderlin says, ending and beginning no longer rhyme in tragedy, and become a matter of thinking themselves. So in what ways is sociality involved in this? This peculiar sociality in Claude Zimmel, Deleuze, like Gabriel Tard, a 19th century French sociologist, Clark, an American, who took up these ideas, and they, for him, substitute for the problem individual and collective, the problem of micro and macro. And therefore, they get at a notion of relations that are not fixed in identities, but are connected to the singularities of a life. And it's this very element of sociality that Deleuze sees cinema finding a peculiar way of attaining once it went into speaking cinema. For the addition of the sound image, the music, and the voice is not simply an addition to the visual one, but an original dimension which shows something that can't so easily be attained in Roman shows, traditions or in silent film. And that thing are those conversations or interactions of a sociality that doesn't follow from pre-existing social functions or strata or relations anymore from the prescribed actions and relations of a sort that Deleuze analyzed in this idea of mondanité, worldliness in Proust. So, but maybe this element of sociality is interesting in our connections and exchanges and the way Deleuze might participate in them. And maybe this idea of inventing complexes of thinking that depart from the way the senses are organized or given at a time, introducing other spaces and times into them, as suggesting a style of critical aesthetic relations that institutionally very different from the romantic idea of the avant-garde with its Pope and its journal and its manifesto. Does this model now provide us new ways of continuing this thinking process? It's with that question that I would like, therefore, to end and see whether you have any reactions to what I've said so far.
Okay, we have some time for some questions. Have we got the microphone? Do we have the microphone? Yeah, okay.
You suggested that the image of the void and kind of the loss that comes with it would be rejected by Deleuze, and of course it's become quite popular in monumental forms from Libeskind and Eisenman and so on. Is there a visual metaphor in terms of monuments that you think would be more Deleuzian?
That's the question, in effect, that I wanted to take up by looking at some specific examples. The problem of the void in Liebeskind's monument, obviously a central one and a source of debate. The Eisenman-Serra monument, now in construction in Berlin, strikes me as not being based on the idea of where these pillars, this wave of pillars. I don't know what it's going to look like. It maybe it's concrete that fills up this space. So, in the Eisenman, so that's one thing that's interesting maybe about the Eisenman-Serra proposal. I include Serra since he was part of it until Helmut Kohl decided then they had to make some changes. I brought with me the lecture that Richard Serra therefore gave to explain these concepts. And in it, and in what Eisenman says about it as well, instead of absence or uncanny, you have these terms of time and memory and so forth. You also have the problem of mass, because in some kinds of monuments, the idea is that each individual dead person, like after September 11, they all appeared in the New York Times, each one alone with their own story. That's also a picture of a monument. Each one, in fact, one of the requirements for September 11 monument is that everybody would be individually mentioned. So Eisenman and Serra, they depart a little bit from that too. That's one kind of example. Of course, I think what's interesting in thinking about the problem is to read lots of stuff that helps pose the problem and to keep it an open artistic problem. I'm not saying that they've solved the best way of doing it. I wanted to look also at some other examples. There's this Han Haka monument, which I think is sort of interesting because of the problem it poses about citizenship, nationality, population, things. Krzysztof Rajchman has a monumental practice. He's now about to build a monument in Nantes. It's the first time he's actually built something, but he certainly had a practice of intervening and of thinking about monuments that fits with some of these concerns. So I'll give you a few examples. I don't know if there's a single aesthetic solution to the problem. I guess part of the claim is that that's one area. Of course, Serra and Eisenman, they had a disagreement over whether it's sculpture or architecture. I don't know, I find it very interesting. But it's one area that involves architects, let's say, in which this problem is posed. And Serra, for example, in his lecture, he says, that the monument and the modern are incompatible. And so you have to change the form of the monument. And you don't want to just import minimalist or modernist ideas. You have to rethink the conventional monument. Anyway, those are some ideas of how, I'm not saying you would make a Deleuzean monument or something like that. It's more that Deleuze helps to formulate in an interesting way a larger field of problems in which artists and sculptors and so forth think about this now. And I'll try to say more about this and how I think about it myself for the actual thing.
For me, the big problem is beyond theory to formulate what one can call materiality in so-called real architecture. This materialistic capitalist world calls the product still the important bit. But to translate what I think Deleuze or the experience of Deleuze into contemporary or whatever architecture, one has to transfer the spatiality like the architect is thinking in rooms, in entrances, in events related to spatiality and not the other way around, about the process which may create a kind of materiality which can, I think, only be related to memory, and that is the exact materiality itself, and the physicality or materiality of the thinking of the architect has to step back towards to allow the process to take over and only appear as materiality in the most limited way. And I think the problem with the translation or whatever from the philosophy into the practice of architecture is really the thinking that one still thinks in spaces and products and not in processes and memories which allow the way to redefine the understanding of physicality in architecture. So in your workshops, are you relating a bit to that?
Well, I consider the workshop very open, so maybe somebody would like to bring up this problem. I think it's an interesting one. Of course, I'm not an architect, so I'm hoping that you'll be able to help me with this problem. But of course, the question of time and materials posed by many different people. And Walter Benjamin, he didn't like glass. He thought it was incredibly barbaric, just because it couldn't show time, for example. So and he wanted to have materials that some other time. So, but what is it to show time or movement in materials? That's an interesting problem in its own right. Richard Serra, to come back to him, his sculpture is based on getting away from looking at a figure on a pedestal, creating a space in which they actually all move around. So it is movement. And that general or of course, as I said earlier, but I think there's an interesting philosophical problem that's also an aesthetic problem, which, of course, as architecture often thinks of materiality in terms of space, and of course they should, but what does it mean to also introduce this sense of process, time, duration, into the very idea of materiality? What does this mean for architects? That's a problem.
Could I maybe just kind of push the first question like a bit further? If one kind of takes Deleuze and sometimes you take kind of René at sort of one end and then put it into the issue of the injunction to remember, clearly as it were the opposite of it is the injunction to remember as understood by something like the film of Schindler's List. You know, I mean, a sort of kitsch production in which the invocation to remember comes as much with an invocation to sort of like get the historical detail right. And one, I think, can immediately kind of think of architecture kind of equivalence in a sort of revivalism which kind of relates to that. But more specifically, I mean, it ultimately ends up with the paradox that the pursuit of sort of historical detail actually constitutes a kind of pathology of memory. That you actually get a false memory syndrome, kind of as it were, through that kind of kitsch addiction. To the point where one, you know, I think architecturally could begin to ask, you know, is there such a thing as like false monument syndrome, kind of in architecture, which goes, as it were, as an attempt to produce the subjective effect of concentrating on the fact that it did happen, whereas the René is always on the side of this is possible. I mean, it's as if, on the one hand, a certain economy about the past pitted against a kind of domain of possibility, which is where the radicalism of the injunction to remember comes from, that this can happen, and as it were, the tense of the verb is neither past, present, nor future. It's a permanent possibility. And so I think actually, that would yield a kind of preliminary way of thinking about certain monuments, which perhaps in the 80s were unconditionally kind of verified through the invocation of memory, but where in a sense that category now looks a whole lot more problematic, especially when we moved on to the proposals for New York.
Yes.
Kantian concept of time, which is inner sensitivity, and then you jump to cinematography time.
Yes.
And to my mind, the cinematography is externalizes every kind of perception. It has nothing to do with the inner sense of time. And memory, too, is not inner sense of time. It's something external. How did you combine or connect these two very opposite and contradictory notions?
Well, the problem of what it means to say that space and time are subjective in Kant is an interesting problem in its own right. And lots of people have said things about it. I was focusing on this one way of thinking about Kant, according to which before you have time is a succession, space is objects in the states of that succession. And that's why, for example, Leibniz, he thinks the world is the best of all possible worlds. It unfolds ultimately according to a principle of reason. So, what's interesting in Kant, in part, is that space and time are forms of intuition, as the transcendental aesthetic. They affect us before we, and therefore you have inner sense and outer sense. And Deleuze thinks that there's simultaneously two things that happen. One, you break the way from time of succession and space of simultaneity, and you pose the problem, space and time, not simply as objective features of the universe, but as those features in some kind of relationship to us. Okay, so that's one aspect of it. And the nature of the subject to which those forms of intuition appeal is the so-called transcendental subject. So the I think, transcendental I think, which is different from you and me, or our bodies, whatever, is determined in time. So Deleuze took this idea and suggested that cinema itself provided the technical means to explore this problem as I just described it, because what happens is you have what he calls framing, cadrage, that determines, those are the shots in a cinematic sequence, that determines the objects in relations to each other within a frame, but in relationship to an outside, which is another frame. So there's always this orcade, the outside, and then the montage, the editing, is putting together all these different frames according to a logic, which is movement when there's an open hole and time when it's this relationship to the outside. So basically, cinema is exploring in sensory form, or it's making sensory, this time that's no longer part of movement or succession, and which has another relation, another subjective relationship to us. So how does that subjective relation figure in the films? It's that the time itself, this time, that's not, that in the case of Rene, of course that documentary a long time ago, is where you have these sheets of the past that nobody can grasp. You have a cinematic way of exploring a space-time, if I put it like that, that's related to us subjectively, and yet is not reducible to or can't be grasped by a transcendental subject. And that relation, what we do with that space and time, is what Deleuze tried to develop as distinct from Husserl. Because he saw Husserl as still too transcendental. Husserl wanted to anchor us in the world. So when Deleuze talks about Husserl in the books on film, he says Husserl wanted ultimately to have these things that didn't fit in the light road all form part of something that would give us more subjectivity in the world. What's great about cinema is instead of centering everything in consciousness, it explores this acentric space that comes before in consciousness. In that sense, it goes beyond, it takes up Kant's idea, but beyond what Kant called transcendental objectivity. I'm sorry for the philosophical response. I don't know if that's helpful.
Okay, well, I mean, that's, we might end for this evening, but could I just say, before we close, that John's going to be continuing to kind of discuss these issues over the next 2 days. There will be a seminar tomorrow at 10 o'clock in the soft room, and the following day at 10 o'clock in Studio 2. So it remains for me to thank you very much and to look forward to the next 2 days.